Boy, have you ever made a mess of things. Did you really ask this woman what you gotta do to make her love you? Don't you realize that she's in training to be a nun? If I were you, I'd worry about what's gonna happen when lightning strikes you. I don't think there's anything you can do to make her want you. Do you realize the sad, sad situation you put her in? First of all, she's taken a vow of chastity. Second, you're blackmailing her and holding her brother Claudio's life in your very hands. And it's getting even more and more absurd because I have a feeling that even if she did consent to your indecent proposal, you still wouldn't keep your end of the bargain and save her brother's life. You're asking me, why can't we talk this over? Because what you did was a breach of your responsibility, and justice demands that you behave like the honorable man Duke Vincenzio took you for. It seems to me that you had your wits about you until you laid eyes on Isabella. What do I got to do to make you realize that you've thrown your high standards for morality and living without lust right out the window the moment you saw her? You even acknowledged that it's your sin and not hers. What have I got to do to make you realize how wrong this is to her and to her brother, not to mention poor Mariana? Why don't you ask her if you could talk this over? So get a grip on yourself, Lord Angelo. If Duke Vincenzio finds out what you've been up to, I hope that you will have the class to come clean and apologize, even when for you, sorry seems to be the hardest word. In the 1993 movie Indecent Proposal, Robert Redford offers Demi Moore and her husband Woody Harrelson $1 million if he can sleep with Demi Moore. In Measure for Measure, you will see how a similar proposition is made by Lord Angelo to a woman who's just entered the convent and wishes to save her brother's life. Duke Vincenzio of Vienna leaves the city and appoints Lord Angelo, a strict judge, to act as his deputy until he returns. Lucio, a frequenter of brothels and alehouses, and some soldiers are bantering when Mistress Overdone, the operator of a brothel, scolds them for their flippant talk. She compares their bad behavior to that of the relatively upstanding Claudio, who is soon to be executed for the crime of sleeping with a woman out of wedlock. Lucio is astonished at the news and rushes off. Pompey Bum, an employee of Mistress Overdone, enters and brings her more distressing news. Lord Angelo has issued a proclamation that all the brothels in the suburbs are to be torn down. On his way to prison, Claudio explains to Lucio what has happened to him. Claudio was engaged to be married to his lover Juliet, but as they had not yet completed their legal technicalities, they were still considered unmarried when Juliet became pregnant. Lord Angelo is enforcing laws that Vincenzio had let slide, including a legal clause stating that fornication is punishable by death. Hearing this, Lucio leaves to visit Claudio's sister, a novice nun named Isabella, and asks her to intercede on Claudio's behalf. Following Lucio's revelation to her, Isabella quickly obtains an audience with Lord Angelo and pleads for mercy for her brother's life. As she pleads, Angelo becomes filled with lusty desire for Isabella, and he eventually offers her a proposition. He will spare Claudio's life if Isabella will yield him her virginity. Isabella refuses and threatens to publicly expose his lechery, but Angelo says that no one will believe her word over his reputation. Isabella visits Claudio in prison and tells him to prepare for death. Claudio desperately begs Isabella to save his life, but she refuses to yield to Lord Angelo, saying it would be wrong for her to sacrifice her immortal soul to save Claudio's earthly life. She is furious at her brother for even asking, and she leaves his cell in a huff. Meanwhile, Duke Vincenzio hasn't actually left the city. Instead, he's disguised himself as a friar named Lodovick so that he can secretly view the city's affairs and the effects of Lord Angelo's temporary rule. Dressed as a friar, he befriends Isabella in the prison and with her help arranges some tricks to thwart Angelo's evil intentions. First, a bed trick is arranged. Angelo has previously refused to fulfill a betrothal to a lady named Mariana, despite her love for him because her dowry was lost at sea. Isabella comes to an agreement with Mariana and then sends word to Angelo that Isabella will submit to him provided that their meeting occurs in total darkness and in silence. Mariana takes Isabella's place and has sexual relations with Angelo, who believes it is Isabella in bed with him. Since the law considers this a consummation of their betrothal, they are now considered married. However, after the act, Lord Angelo goes back on his word and sends a message to the prison to have Claudio beheaded, thus necessitating the head trick. The Duke attempts to arrange the execution of another prisoner whose head could be sent in Claudio's place. However, the degenerate criminal Barnardine refuses to be executed in his drunken state. So instead, the head of Ragozine, a pirate who recently died in the prison, is sent to Lord Angelo instead. The Duke returns to Vienna. Isabella and Mariana publicly petition him, and he hears their claims against Lord Angelo, which Angelo denies outright. But as the scene develops, it appears that Friar Lodovick will be blamed for the accusations leveled against Lord Angelo. The Duke leaves Angelo to judge the cause against Lodovick, but returns in disguise when Lodovick is summoned a few minutes later. While Lord Angelo attempts to seal the case against Lodovick, the Duke reveals himself, thereby exposing Angelo as a liar and confirming the allegations brought by Isabella and Mariana. He proposes that Angelo be executed, but first compels him to marry Mariana so that his estate will go to Mariana in compensation for her lost dowry. Mariana pleads for Angelo's life and even enlists Isabella, who is not yet aware that her brother Claudio is still alive because of the dead trick. The Duke initially pretends not to heed the women's petitions until he reveals that Claudio has not in fact been executed, at which point he relents. The Duke then proposes marriage to Isabella. Lucio, who frequently slandered the Duke, who was actually disguised as the friar, is punished and forced to marry Kate Keepdown, the prostitute he impregnated and abandoned before he is whipped and hanged. When we come back, we'll look at some of the major characters in Measure for Measure. Let's look at some of the major characters in Measure for Measure. First, we have Vincenzio, who is the Duke of Vienna, and while he's a good man, he's also been very lax in enforcing the laws regarding fornication. Lord Angelo becomes the Duke's appointed deputy when the Duke pretends to leave Vienna. He's a man of high moral caliber, but he's not without his faults, including reneging on a betrothal to Mariana after she's lost her dowry and succumbing to his lust for Isabella when she pleads for her brother's life. Next, we have Isabella, or Isabella she's frequently called. She's a novice who has just entered the sisterhood of the Order of St. Clare. She's a remarkable woman, devout in her faith, pure in her heart, and courageous in her pursuit of justice. Claudio is Isabella's brother, who has impregnated his soon-to-be wife, Juliet, or Madame Julietta, as she's also known. Lord Angelo plans on using Claudio to set an example by having him beheaded for violating Vienna's law against fornication. Lucio is a fantastic, or an eccentric person, who is a friend of Claudio's, a go-between for Isabella and Lord Angelo, and a constant criticizer of Duke Vincenzio to Friar Lodovick, whom Lucio doesn't realize is actually the Duke in disguise. In fact, the longer the play goes on, the lower he stoops in his usefulness. We also have Pompey Bum, a tapster and a bawd to Mistress Overdone. His job is to attract customers for her brothels. Shakespeare uses him to add much humor, to the play and offer an insightful commentary about the anti-fornication laws. For example, in Act 2, Scene 1, Aeschylus, who is an old lord and Lord Angelo's secondary, addresses Pompey when he's brought in by a constable. Aeschylus asks him his name, and he says, "My name is Pompey Bum." Bum is the British word for rear end. And Aeschylus comments, "Troth, your bum is the greatest thing about you, so in the beastliest sense, you are Pompey the Great. Pompey, you are partly bawd. Pompey, howsoever you color it in being a tapster, are you not? Come, tell me true, it shall be the better for you." And Pompey pleads, "Truly, sir, I am a poor fellow that would live." Aeschylus replies, "How would you live, Pompey? By being a bawd? What do you think of the trade, Pompey? Is it a lawful trade?" And he replies, "If the law would allow it." And Aeschylus says, "But the law will not allow it, Pompey, nor shall it be allowed in Vienna." Pompey asks, "Does your worship mean to geld and splay, meaning spay, all the youth of the city?" Aeschylus says, "No." And Pompey replies, saying, "Truly, sir, in my opinion, they will to it then." Aeschylus says, "There are pretty orders beginning, I can tell you. It is but heading," which is beheading, "and hanging." And Pompey replies, "If ye head and hang all that offend that way but for 10 year together, you'll be glad to give out a commission for more heads. If this law hold in Vienna 10 year, I'll rent the fairest house in it 3 pence a bay. If you live to see this come to pass, say Pompey told you so." And finally, we have Elbow, who is the poor duke's constable and is responsible for cleaning up all the vice in Vienna. Elbow is similar to Constable Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing, and is constantly misplacing and misusing words. Shakespeare knew that the audience would find it amusing to portray people in authority as bumblers, and he certainly was right. All right, now let's take a look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes in Measure for Measure. Shakespeare uses outrageous legal matters as plot devices so that he can see how different people will deal with them. In The Merchant of Venice, it was a bond requiring a pound of flesh as payment. In Measure for Measure, it is a previously unenforced law requiring execution as punishment for fornication. This allows Shakespeare to show how different people with different roles and values will address life's problems. Another one of Shakespeare's most popular plot devices is disguising characters as someone else. In Measure for Measure, Duke Vincentio spends the majority of the play disguised as Friar Lodowick so that he can observe firsthand what people are doing in his absence. Shakespeare also does this in Henry V, when the king disguises himself to walk unrecognized among the soldiers the night before the Battle of Agincourt. As a result of the Duke's disguise, he learned that Lord Angelo has been corrupted by power, that Isabella is a good and virtuous maid, whom he eventually asks to marry him, and that Lucio is a slanderous gossip who not only has nothing good to say about the Duke, but brags about how he impregnated a prostitute by the name of Kate Keepdown and lied to avoid having to marry her. Next we have Act 2, Scene 2, when Isabella first goes to Lord Angelo and begs for her brother's life. This is a crucial scene for 2 reasons. First, we see how skillful Isabella is in moving people with her words and demeanor. Second, we see that Angelo is indeed susceptible to lustful temptation when confronted with a virtuous and desperate woman. When she's leaving, Isabella says, "Save your honor." And Angelo replies, "From thee, even from thy virtue." What's this? What's this? Is this her fault or mine? The tempter or the tempted? Who sins most? Not she, nor does she tempt, but it is I that lying by the violet in the sun do as the carrion does, not as the flower, corrupt with virtuous season. Can it be that modesty may more betray our sense than woman's lightness? Having waste ground enough, shall we desire to raise the sanctuary and pitch our evils there? Oh, fie, fie, fie! What dost thou, Or what art thou, Angelo? Doth thou desire her foully for those things that make her good? Oh, let her brother live. Thieves, for their robbery have authority when judges steal themselves. What? Do I love her? That I desire to hear her speak again and feast upon her eyes. What is thy dream on, O cunning enemy, that to catch a saint, with saints dost bait thy hook? Most dangerous is that temptation that doth goad us on to sin in loving virtue. Never could the strumpet with all her double vigor, art and nature once stir my temper. But this virtuous maid subdues me quite. Even till now, when men were fond, I smiled and wondered how. It should be noted that all of the main characters in this play are given a different mixture of good and bad qualities, thus making them more three-dimensional, human, and relatable to the audience. And finally, we have Act 5, Scene 1, when Isabella demands the returned Duke give her justice. This is the longest scene in the play, and typical of a Shakespeare comedy, virtually all of the characters are present for it. But what's most unique about this scene is that the Duke asks Isabella to marry him, but there is no instruction as to how she's supposed to answer. Since it's a comedy, most readers presume that she will say yes, but Shakespeare has left it up to your imagination. When I started doing seminars, I asked a man why he was coming to my seminars. He paused for a moment and he said, "You stir up ideas in my head." I think that's what Shakespeare is doing here, so feel free to write your own ending. All right, now let's take a look at some of the major themes and motivations in this play. We'll start with power and justice. In Measure for Measure, we see a classic power struggle between Lord Angelo and desperate Isabella. He is in a position to wield enormous influence over her in order to save her brother's life. But unlike most people faced with this dilemma, she doesn't back down and stands by her principles and faith. Thus, Isabella uses her power and the assistance of the disguised Duke to receive justice for her wrongs. As we see, justice often has many gray areas. The anti-fornication law has been on the books for many years, but has not been enforced. Lord Angelo believes that justice must be carried out, and so he begins enforcing the laws. However, it is also Angelo who must face justice when he abuses his power to pursue Isabella in a lustful way. The fact that he is called to account at the end of the play demonstrates that he too will receive justice. Let's continue with some more themes in this play. Lust and innocence. In Measure for Measure, lust is prevalent throughout the entire play. Other than Pericles, this is the only Shakespeare play with several scenes taking place in a brothel. We have fornication run rampant, houses of ill repute being torn down, and we have Lord Angelo, the deputy, who has been left in charge, who cannot stop lusting over the virtuous and desperate Isabella. There is an overarching message that while we are all given to temptations, we need to find it in ourselves to learn to overcome them. If we don't, then laws need to be created to teach us how to govern ourselves. In other words, when we abuse our privileges, our freedoms are taken away. In Isabel, Shakespeare created one of the most admirable and virtuous female characters. If she has flaws, we don't see them. She is resolute in her convictions, and she does not waver. We see this after Claudio, her brother, begins to panic and fear his own death. As he talks with Isabel in his prison cell, he begins to grow fearful of what awaits him. And he says, "Aye, but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and uncertain thought imagine howling, 'Tis too horrible. The weariest and most loathed worldly life that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature is a paradise to what we fear of death. After he relates this to Isabel, Claudio pleads to her to go through with Angelo's request, but Isabel is made of stronger stuff and doesn't yield to his temporal petitions, and she angrily replies, "O you beast! O faithless coward! O dishonest wretch! Wilt thou be made a man out of my vice? Is it not a kind of incest to take life from thine own sister's shame? What should I think? Heaven shield my mother played my father fair, for such a warped slip of wilderness ne'er issued from his blood. Take my defiance, die, perish. Might but my bending down reprieve thee from thy fate. It should proceed, I'll pray 1,000 prayers for thy death, no word to save thee." Thus we see the difference between one who sins and asks someone else to pay the price for their forgiveness, and one who is completely invested in her faith and strives to avoid sin at all cost. In other words, it's better to be right alone than to be wrong with 1,000 others. As we move into some of the most powerful lines in Measure for Measure, there's also some very short but amusing lines worth mentioning. For example, when Mistress Overdone asks Pompey why Claudio is being carried to prison, instead of saying for getting Madame Juliet with child, he says, "For groping for trouts in a peculiar river." Talk about euphemisms. When Mistress Overdone hears that the brothels are to be plucked down in the suburbs, she worries what's going to happen to her. Pompey comforts her by saying, "Come, fear not you. Good counselors lack no clients. You that have worn your eyes almost out in the service, you'll be considered." When Lord Angelo listens to the silliness of Elbow, Pompey, and Master Froth, he exclaims, "This will last out a night in Russia where nights are longest." And then he says to Aeschylus, "I'll take my leave and leave you to the hearing of this cause, hoping you'll find good cause to whip them all." And finally, in Act 2, Scene 2, we hear Isabella's moving speech for Mercy, which is very reminiscent of Portia's quality of Mercy speech in The Merchant of Venice. As Isabella pleads to Lord Angelo for mercy for her brother Claudio, she says, "Believe this, no ceremony that to great ones belongs, not the king's crown, nor the deputed sword, the marshal's truncheon, nor the judge's robe become them with one half so good a grace as mercy does. If he had been as you and you as he, you would have slipped like him, but he, like you, would not have been so stern. I would to heaven I had your potency and you were Isabel. Should it then be thus? No, I would tell what 'twere to be a judge and what a prisoner. Alas, alas, why all the souls that were forfeit once, and he that might the vantage best have took, found out the remedy. In other words, God sent Jesus Christ to die for our sins. How would you be if he, which is the top of judgment, should but judge you as you are? Oh, think on that, and mercy then will breathe within your lips like man new made. Good, good, my lord, bethink you. Who is it that hath died for this offense? There's many have committed it. Oh, it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most ignorant of what he's most assured, his glassy essence like an angry ape, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as make the angels weep, who, with our spleens, would all themselves laugh mortal. We cannot weigh our brother with ourself. Authority, though it err like others, hath yet a kind of medicine in it, that skins the vice o'er the top. Go to your bosom, knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know that's like my brother's fault. If it confess a natural guiltiness such as his, let it not sound a thought upon your tongue against my brother's life. Coming up, we'll look at some of the major turning points and correlations in Measure for Measure. In Measure for Measure, Shakespeare employs three of the most successful plot devices for Elizabethan comedy: the bed trick, the head trick, and the dead trick. And each of them allows the heroic characters to buy time until they can gain leverage and turn the tables against their opposing counterparts. The bed trick is used to substitute one woman in bed for another in order to trick a man into thinking that he's gone to bed with one woman when in reality he really hasn't. Not only do we see this here with Mariana substituting herself for Isabel to dupe Angelo, we'll see it again in All's Well That Ends Well, when Helen and Diana switch places to trick Bertram. The head trick is used to convince someone that a certain person has died by substituting someone else's head as proof. In Measure for Measure, the provost uses Ragazine's head to convince Lord Angelo that Claudio has been beheaded. Finally, we have the dead trick. This is when someone is told that a specific person is dead when in fact he or she is not. In Measure for Measure, Friar Lodovick tells Isabella that her brother Claudio has been executed, although he is alive. In this case, the Duke does this to heighten her joy at the end of the play, perhaps hoping she will accept his marriage proposal. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet takes a sleeping potion in hopes of convincing her parents that she is dead in order to escape an arranged marriage to the County Paris. In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra sends word through her eunuch to Mark Antony that she has killed herself. Unfortunately, he believes that lie and he kills himself. And in The Life and Death of King John, Hubert tells the king that young Arthur is dead, even though Hubert doesn't kill him. Unfortunately, Arthur tries to escape on his own and winds up falling to his death from a castle wall. As you can see, they tend to backfire when used in the tragedies and the history plays, but they're much more successful in the comedies. In The Winter's Tale, Hermione pretends to be dead until her slander has been exposed, and then she reconciles with her husband. In Much Ado About Nothing, Hero also pretends to be dead until her slander is exposed, but then she takes the trick one step further. Since Claudio wants to atone for slandering Hero, he agrees to marry her cousin sight unseen, but he's thrilled when she unveils herself and he sees that it's really Hero that he has wed. So I guess in this case, we would call that the wed trick. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research and I found some interesting facts. Shakespeare's primary source for Measure was derived from the story of Epitia, which was written by an Italian author named Cinthio 38 years earlier in 1565. But both the theme and the title were taken from the Holy Bible, specifically the Sermon on the Mount Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, which read, "Judge not, that you may not be judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you again." This theme of a woman willing to lay down her body to save a loved one is a very old one. It's the tale of the dishonest judge. And in almost all cases, even after the woman succumbs to the pressure, the judge still winds up killing the loved one. Bob Dylan wrote a song called The Seven Curses about a horse thief, and the same thing happens there. Led Zeppelin also wrote a similar song called Gallows Pole with the same results. But it's only in Measure for Measure that we see Isabella come out on top as a winner and receive justice. Now let's take a look at some of the excellent actors in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Measure for Measure. The BBC splurged to get Kate Nelligan to play Isabella, and she was perfectly cast in this role. In fact, it's the only time she appears in any of these Shakespeare plays. Tim Pigott-Smith, who plays Lord Angelo, also played Harry Percy, or Hotspur, in Henry IV Part 1 that same year. Christopher Strawley, who plays Claudio, also plays Benvolio in Romeo and Juliet, 1 year before this one. Frank Middlemass, who plays Pompey Bum, also plays the Fool in the 1982 version of King Lear. Kevin Stoney, who plays Aeschylus, also plays Rinaldo in the 1981 version of All's Well That Ends Well. Christopher McHenry, who plays Lucio, also played Mercutio in the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli version of Romeo and Juliet. Alan Armstrong, who plays the Provost, also played Monsieur Thénardier, the master of the house, in the 10th anniversary concert of the Broadway musical Les Miserables in 2018, and both Alan Armstrong and Christopher McHenry each played multiple parts in the 1982 Royal Shakespeare Company version of Nicholas Nickleby opposite Roger Rees. And now get ready for today's trivia challenge, which is called Everybody Plays the Fool. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge called Everybody Plays the Fool. I'd like you to identify the Shakespeare play for which these fools are known. Number 1 is Yorick. Number 2 is Touchstone. And number 3 is Feste the Jester. When we get back, we'll look at some relevant lessons from Measure for Measure, and I'll have the answers to these questions for you. All right, so how did you do with today's trivia challenge, Everybody Plays the Fool? Let's see. You're to identify the Shakespeare plays for which these fools are known. Number 1 was Yorick. Of course, that was Hamlet. Number 2 was Touchstone from As You Like It. And number 3, Feste the Jester, was, of course, from Twelfth Night. Let's look at some relevant lessons from Measure for Measure. First of all, as Lucio says to Isabella, our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win by fearing to attempt. In other words, don't allow fear to stop you from achieving your goals, or you will miss the opportunity to right wrongs and achieve justice. Next, if you're a leader, make sure that you observe the people you promote or delegate authority to, because ultimately you are responsible for the outcome. And third, realize that there are always going to be temptations, but as Angelo says, 'tis one thing to be tempted, another thing to fall. As we saw with Angelo himself, he was steadfast until he encountered Isabella. He wasn't tempted by strumpets, but by a virtuous maiden. But as Isabella rightly assessed, I partly think a due sincerity governed his deeds till he did look on me. So remember to be on your guard, because temptation always finds us when we least expect it. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo on Shakespeare. Please join me next time when you will see a monarch who would rather sit on the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings than settle disputes fairly, which leads to the loss of his crown, among other things.